Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever it may be for you. First, I apologize that this is late. Going out of town this weekend kind of messed things up a little bit. Um, Got back yesterday, just didn't really feel like doing this, so I wanted to be a little bit fresher. Though, the truth is, I'm probably going to sniffle my way through this like I did the video for the other class. So please excuse any sniffling that you may hear. This weather is doing a number on me at the moment. All right, so what our topic today is, I'll be drinking a lot because my throat is dry, is George Washington's presidency and John Adams' presidency. So, the Electoral College met for the first time on February 4th, 1789, met in state capitals, unanimously chose George Washington. John Adams got the came in second with half as many votes. He became vice president. Remember, you vote for two people on the Electoral College, and whoever gets the most is president, second most is vice president. We'll see how messed up that gets later. In Congress, there will be the fight between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The first issue was constitutional amendments. Remember, the way they got the Constitution passed was to offer a Bill of Rights. James Madison runs for Congress. Even though he didn't actively campaign, he does win because of the support of the Baptists. And he's elected to basically do the Bill of Rights. He saw them as politically necessary. He took many amendments, whittled them down to 12, and sent them to the Senate. He took many amendments, passed them. The Senate whittled them down to 12, and then sent them to the states for ratification. The states did not adopt the first two, which had to do with legislation apportionment, which probably would have ended gerrymandering as we know it today, which would have been a good thing. Some states are trying to do that. The second was about congressional salaries, saying you couldn't raise your own salary during your own term. That one will eventually be passed in the 1990s. Collectively, the first 10 amendments are known as the Bill of Rights. And you can look at them. You just did the Constitution comparison. So now we have to fill out the other branches of government. It took 6 months to create the judicial system because they were afraid that the federal constitution could swallow up state constitutions. So they created a three-tiered court system. At the bottom was the district court, then next up the circuit court, and then the Supreme Court. Each state would have at least one district. The circuit would be for several districts, and the circuit court would be one district judge and two Supreme Court justices, and they would basically ride the circuit, meaning that they would hold court in the different district court buildings. Obviously, we've changed that since. The circuit court would hear appeals from the district court and would be the primary jurisdiction in some cases, especially between states. For instance, a few years ago, Kentucky and Ohio were fighting over a rock that was in the middle of the ocean because it looked like a smiley face. For the executive branch, they created cabinet positions: the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Treasury, the Secretary of War, and the Attorneys General. Henry Knox was the first Secretary of War. Edmund Randolph was the Attorneys General. Thomas Jefferson was the Secretary of State, and Alexander Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury. Washington chose from all factions. Hamilton, for instance, was definitely a Federalist, while Jefferson was more of the states' rights party. The temporary home of the government was New York City near Wall Street. The size of the federal government was about 350. For instance, the State Department had 2 clerks, 2 assistants, and a part-time translator. The Treasury was a much larger department, and you could kind of see the differences in approach between Jefferson and Hamilton. Um, Treasury was much longer. In fact, it was larger than the state and war departments combined. Uh, Alexander Hamilton wanted a strong national government. He really wanted it to be more like the British model. He will be opposed by both Madison and Jefferson, who were more along the lines of states' rights. Alexander Hamilton came from a modest background. He is a self made man. He is born in the West Indies, the illegitimate son of a Scottish merchant. He is orphaned at an early age. He worked very hard. I guess you could watch the musical on Disney Plus if you want to. He rose through the ranks of the Continental Army, becoming Washington's personal aide. He married into a prominent New York family, became successful as a lawyer. He viewed democracy with suspicion. He wanted the federal government to assume the debts of all the states, which would have been over $75 million. This scared some, but not Alexander Hamilton. He saw debt as a tool of finance. What he wanted to do was to consolidate the debt of the states, and that way creditors who held state notes would be able to exchange them for federal notes and then redeem them for the original value of the note. What he wanted to do was he wanted to tax whiskey to basically pay for the interest on the debt and the government. He wanted a public-funded national debt. Taxes would pay the interest, and he would then borrow to pay for government. The problem that many people had with this was the idea of speculators who had bought up these state notes, oftentimes pennies on the dollar. And Madison and Jefferson did not want to pay full value because it would put a lot of money in the hands of a few individuals. Madison thought that it would create vast inequalities of wealth. And, he's not wrong. And Madison and Jefferson believed that it would undermine the Republican government. Jefferson invited Madison and Hamilton to dinner to work out a deal. Madison and Jefferson did support the plan to take on the debt. And I think in this case, Hamilton is correct because this is the first action of the new federal government when it comes to debt. And it's very important to show up front that you can pay what you owe. And so that's why it's probably important to do that, even though you have these speculators. So Madison and Jefferson support this plan, and Hamilton agrees to move the capital away from New York and Philadelphia to Washington, D.C., where it will be today. Now, what they planned is that Jefferson and Madison wanted out of New York City. So they would, because they wanted to get away from the financial interest just followed them. So the government would temporarily relocate to Philadelphia, and then later on to the Potomac, which will be surveyed by Washington himself. Hamilton also wanted to create a national bank, the Bank of the United States, which would be a depository of government funds and would make loans. The government would own part of the stake in the bank, but would also have private investors. And he felt like this would stabilize the national economy. Now, Jefferson and others Madison opposed it. They're very suspicious of this. Thought it'd be too much power for the federal government. Now, the national bank, as we will see, will be very controversial at different times up through the Civil War. And at the time, I think it's really necessary because there really aren't a lot of banks, and we do need the stability for the national economy. So Congress charters the national bank, and Washington does not veto it, even though Jefferson wanted him to. Hamilton argued for a loose interpretation of the Constitution, and Washington will often side with Hamilton during his first term. Hamilton also wanted a national mint. Jefferson actually supported the idea not because he wanted to make money, but because he thought the minting process was pretty cool. He wanted to learn how to do it. Hamilton also wanted government incentives for business, and he wanted high tariffs. Congress would not raise tariffs quickly and, sharply. Hamilton and Jefferson are going to be kind of the two who are duking out for the different positions in the government. Hamilton is pro-British, Jefferson is pro-French. We begin to see partisanship without political parties. We begin to see more newspapers which are partisan. There were 100 newspapers in 1788. There are over 200 in 1800. I don't know how many we have now, but they seem to be shrinking. We began to see more papers in the interior of the country. We also began to see operatives like John Beckley destroy their political opponents, in this case, Hamilton. Hamilton will be accused of being a spy, sleeping with a spy. He actually had to cop to the affair, but said that the woman he was sleeping with was not a spy, and basically destroys his political career later on. Democratic Republican societies began to spring up. There are 35 between 1793 and 94. That will eventually morph into the Democratic Republican Party, which Jefferson will be involved in. They wanted to influence public opinion. The French Revolution comes in 1789. The Democratic Republican Society supported it. The Federalists were not as keen on it. In fact, some Democratic Republicans even began to cosplay. They began to wear the tricolor hats, which were famous for those revolutionaries in France, and they began to call each other citizen, as they were doing in France at the time. Though opinion does begin to change as the Revolutionary War goes kind of wonky. If you've ever, you should really study the French Revolution. It's kind of interesting, really. Anyway, revolutionary France declared war on Great Britain in 1793. Many people wanted to support the French. After all, they had supported us in our revolution, and it felt only fair. However, Washington was not so keen on that. Well, 1792 is the second presidential election. Washington doesn't really want to run again, but where there is a fear that he's the only one people will support, so he stands again for re-election. This time there was a contested race for VP between George Clinton and John Adams, which led to one of the first sectional divides we see in the electorate. But ultimately Adams wins out again. During the conflict between France and Britain, the British Navy impounded 250 American ships and even impressed some of our soldiers into service in the British Navy. Washington will send John Jay to negotiate a settlement called Jay's Treaty. The British agreed to compensate the U.S. but did not recognize our right to travel freely. They also promised to vacate forts in the Northwest Territory. And at the same time, we had to deal with violence on the frontier from the Shawnee, Delaware, and Miami Indians, who will try to defend their territory. Back in 1790, a force led by a Little Turtle, defeated General Josiah Harmon in Ohio, and then defeated a force of 900 under General Arthur Clark. This forced the War Department to reorganize in 1794. In 1794, General Anthony Wayne was sent to Indiana at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. In 1795, we forced the Native Americans to sign the Treaty of Grenville, which gave us most of Ohio. In 1794, we have the Whiskey Rebellion in Pennsylvania and Kentucky. In July, it turned violent because people did not want to pay tax on their whiskey. 500 in Pennsylvania marched to the home of the tax collector and burned his house to the ground. 2 protesters were killed. 6,000 then threatened to attack Pittsburgh. Washington dispatched a militia. He led himself with 150. Basically, the rebels did not want to fight Washington, and they basically dispersed. Two were convicted of treason, later were pardoned by Washington. This was the first use of the Insurrection Act. You may have heard of it recently. Um, Now, one of our first international decisions that had to be made was when Saint Dominique, today we know it as Haiti, rose up against the France and declared their independence. It was the largest slave revolt in the history of the world. We had to decide who to support. The Federalists wanted to strengthen their ties with Haiti, after all, be a good trading partner. Democratic Republicans opposed it partly to protect slavery, because they didn't want our slaves to get any ideas. So basically, they just kind of punt on the whole idea and just kind of ignore it. You also have the Democratic Republicans who tended to support the French. So, we do not recognize the new Haiti government, and Haiti obviously has a lot of problems for years to come. So, 1796 comes along, and Washington decides not to run for a third term. He decides to step down. In his last message, he warns against, he said, to steer clear of permanent alliances, that we should only be involved in temporary alliances that benefit us. Even 1796 will be a bitter contest between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. It gets very nasty. Adams will barely win. It soon will end up with a quasi-naval war with France. Kind of the worst thing about all of this is that because of the way the Constitution worked, Thomas Jefferson ends up being the vice president. So Adams wins by 3 electoral votes. So Adams wins. Jefferson becomes vice president. We have a problem with France. The French recalled their diplomatic envoy and began seizing American ships. Adams sent 3 to negotiate. Charles Pinckney, John Marshall, and Elbridge Arney. I don't think that's right. I can't read my writing, I'm afraid. Anyway, we sent 3 delegates, and they met with France. First, they were snobbed. And then 3 French officials came, and they were called X, Y, and Z. They demanded that we give them $250,000 and a $1 million loan for them to even talk to them. And they said that they demanded an apology from John Adams. So we obviously couldn't put up with that, so Adams began to prepare for war. And so we are going to have an undeclared naval war with France that will last for almost 2 years. This will lead to the creation of the Department of the Navy. We will triple the size of our army. We wanted to create a special army of 50,000 that would have been led by Washington. But he wanted Hamilton to be his second in command, so that fell apart. This will lead to a split between the Federalists, between Adams and Hamilton. Congress will pass a new tax to pay for the war. They also passed the Aliens and Seditions Act. The Aliens Act made it more difficult to become a citizen, from 7 to 14 years to be nationalized, and gave the government more power to deport resident aliens. The Sedition Act made it a crime to combine or conspire with the intent to oppose any measure of the federal government. You could not write or utter false scenarios or malicious statements against Congress or the president. You could say anything you want about Vice President Thomas Jefferson. They will actually prosecute over 25 people, $400 fines, and 18 months in prison for one editor of a newspaper. Democratic Republicans tried to get Congress to repeal this, but it didn't. That didn't really work out. What will happen is state legislatures in Kentucky and Virginia will put out the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. The 1798 Virginia resolutions were actually written by James Madison. The Kentucky resolutions by Thomas Jefferson. They argued for states' rights, and they actually went so far as to say that if states did not like a federal law, they could go all the way up to nullification. And this will be very important later when we get into secession and the Civil War. In fact, we'll be using the Kentucky Resolution as a document analysis at the end of the semester. So if you want to go ahead and look that up, feel free. So what this does is it sets up the election of 1800. Adams will have a few advantages in that the war ended with France, but it will be another very nasty election. They will get bitter between each other. In fact, they won't speak for many years after that. We'll actually start with the election of 1800 for next week and talk about the Jeffersonian era. Probably be kind of a longer lecture, so we'll leave this one fairly short this week. Spoiler alert, Jefferson wins, but there's a problem because of Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr will be a very interesting figure next week. I look forward to seeing what your thoughts on Washington Jefferson. I will say Adams will be very important in that he is the first person to give up power to a member of another faction or party, and is probably why the United States government has actually worked for all of this time so far. I have a video for you next week, which will look at the first 5 presidents. And Adams is also very important because he's able to install a lot of Federalist judges, which will give the Federalists some power in the government as they begin to fall out of favor, as we'll begin to see next week. Anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this lecture and you'll enjoy the other material that we'll have. And I'll talk to you next week.